Have you ever wondered how quickly your entire life can change with just one sentence? How a single moment of cruelty witnessed by the right person can shift everything you thought you knew about safety, power, and protection? Sometimes danger doesn't announce itself with sirens or warning signs. Sometimes it sits quietly at the next table, watching, waiting, until someone crosses a line they should never have crossed. Catalina Martinez had always prided herself on being observant. At 24, she'd learned to read people quickly, a skill honed by 3 years of serving tables at Romano's, one of Chicago's most exclusive Italian restaurants. She could spot a bad tipper from across the dining room, knew which customers would send their food back just to feel important, and had mastered the art of defusing tension before it escalated into the kind of scene that got servers fired. Tonight, however, all that careful observation felt useless as she stood frozen beside table 12, Derek's words echoing in her mind like a death sentence. The restaurant hummed with its usual sophisticated energy around them. Crystal glasses clinked against fine china, soft conversations in multiple languages created an elegant backdrop, and the scent of garlic and fresh basil drifted from the kitchen where Chef Antonio worked his magic. Romano's attracted a particular clientele, the kind of people who thought nothing of spending more on dinner than most people made in a week. Catalina had grown comfortable in this world of understated luxury, even if she could never truly be part of it. Her black dress and crisp white apron marked her as staff, but she'd earned the respect of both management and regular customers through her professionalism and genuine warmth. She'd been working here since dropping out of Northwestern University 18 months ago. The decision still stung, but Derek had been right about the financial burden. Her student loans were crushing, her part-time job barely covered expenses, and maintaining her grades while working had become impossible. At least, that's what Derek had convinced her. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and growing unease, she wondered if his concern had been as selfless as he'd claimed. Derek Mitchell sat across from her at table 12, his handsome face twisted into an expression of barely controlled rage. At 28, he was everything she'd thought she wanted when they met 2 years ago. Ambitious, successful in his sales career, confident to the point of arrogance. He dressed well, drove a nice car, and for the first few months, had treated her like she was precious. The shift had been gradual, so subtle she'd almost convinced herself she was imagining it. The criticism disguised as concern. The isolation from friends and family presented as romantic devotion. The financial control wrapped in promises of taking care of her. Tonight's dinner had started badly and deteriorated from there. Derek had insisted on coming to her workplace, despite her gentle protests that it felt awkward to serve him while trying to work. He'd dismissed her concerns with that charming smile that no longer felt quite so charming. From the moment he'd sat down, he'd found fault with everything. Her greeting had been too formal, too distant. The wine list was inadequate. The table location was unacceptable. Each complaint had been delivered with increasing hostility, his voice rising just enough that nearby tables began to glance over with interest. The breaking point came when she'd politely suggested they discuss his concerns later, after her shift. The transformation in his expression had been instantaneous and terrifying. Gone was any pretense of the loving boyfriend. In its place sat a man she was beginning to recognize with growing fear, a man who viewed her as property that had dared to embarrass him. "You think you can talk to me like that here?" he'd hissed, leaning forward with his hands flat on the white tablecloth. "You think because you're at work, because there are people around, you can disrespect me?" His voice had carried just far enough to reach the neighboring tables, and Catalina felt heat flood her cheeks as conversations quieted around them. "I've had enough of your attitude lately, Catalina. You're getting too comfortable, too confident. Maybe dropping out of school wasn't enough to teach you your place." She tried to placate him, to lower her voice and smooth things over. But Derek was past the point of reason. The final words came out like a promise and a threat combined, delivered in a tone that made her blood run cold. "You're done when we get home." The silence that followed felt deafening despite the continued murmur of conversation around them. Catalina's hands shook as she reached for her order pad, desperate to find something to do with her trembling fingers. She'd heard those words before, or variations of them, and they never led anywhere good. Derek's idea of discipline had evolved over the past year, becoming more creative, more psychologically devastating. Physical bruises healed and could be hidden with makeup. The damage he preferred to inflict went much deeper. What she didn't notice, couldn't see from her position facing Derek, was the table directly behind him where three men sat in expensive suits, their conversation having stopped entirely the moment Derek's voice had risen. She didn't see the way the man facing her direction had gone perfectly still, his dark eyes focused with laser intensity on the scene playing out mere feet away. She couldn't see how his companions had subtly shifted in their chairs, ready to move at their boss's slightest signal. Dante Romano had built his reputation on control. At 32, he commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout Chicago's underground. But tonight he sat in his family's legitimate restaurant simply trying to enjoy dinner with his lieutenants. Marco and Alessandro were updating him on territory disputes and profit margins, the kind of mundane business that kept his operations running smoothly. He'd been only half listening, his attention caught by the familiar cadence of fluent Spanish from a neighboring table and the efficient grace of their server. The young woman was beautiful in an understated way that appealed to him. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek bun that emphasized the elegant line of her neck, and her brown eyes held a warmth that seemed genuine rather than practiced. She moved through the dining room with confidence, treating each customer with the same professional courtesy regardless of their attitude or demands. He'd watched her defuse a complaint from Mrs. Henderson about her salmon with such diplomatic skill that the elderly woman had ended up laughing and requesting the server personally for future visits. It was precisely because he'd been watching her that Derek's behavior caught his attention so quickly. Dante had seen enough predators in his life to recognize one immediately, and everything about the man's body language screamed dominance and control. The way he interrupted her explanations, how he dismissed her suggestions with theatrical sighs, the gradual increase in volume designed to humiliate rather than communicate. But it was the final threat that made Dante's blood run cold with a fury he rarely allowed himself to feel. "You're done when we get home." The words carried implications that made his jaw clench and his hand instinctively move toward the gun concealed beneath his tailored jacket. In his world, threats like that usually preceded violence, and violence against women was a line he'd never tolerated. Marco noticed the change in his boss immediately. Dante's entire posture had shifted, the relaxed dinner conversation abandoned in favor of predatory focus. "Sir," Marco murmured quietly, drawing Alessandro's attention as well. Both men followed Dante's gaze to the table behind them where the server stood frozen, her face pale, with what looked like genuine fear. "That's enough," Dante said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made grown men step back. He didn't raise his volume, didn't need to. The words cut through Derek's continued tirade like a blade, causing the other man to turn sharply in his chair. Derek's expression cycled through confusion, irritation, and finally a dawning awareness that he might have made a serious mistake. Dante Romano was not a man most people recognized on sight, but there was something about his presence that commanded immediate respect. Perhaps it was the quality of his suit, easily worth more than most people's monthly salary. Maybe it was the way his companions had instantly shifted to alert attention, like soldiers awaiting orders. Or it could have been something more primal, the instinctive recognition of an apex predator by lesser creatures. "I'm sorry," Derek stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating like steam. "Were we being too loud? I didn't mean to disturb your dinner." Dante rose from his chair with fluid grace, his movements controlled and deliberate. He was tall, probably 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled his charcoal jacket perfectly. His dark hair was styled with precision, and his green-gray eyes held an intensity that made Derek shrink back in his seat. When he spoke, his voice carried the hint of an accent that suggested old-world heritage and new-world power. "You weren't disturbing my dinner," Dante replied, stepping closer to Derek's table. "You were disturbing the lady. And in my establishment, that's unacceptable." The possessive emphasis on my wasn't lost on anyone within hearing distance. Romano's wasn't just where Dante chose to eat. It was his family's restaurant, his territory, his domain. Derek's face went white as the implication sank in, and Catalina found herself caught between fear and fascination as she watched this stranger command the situation with such effortless authority. "I think perhaps your evening here is finished," Dante continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the steel underneath. Marco will be happy to call you a cab. I'm sure you have somewhere else you need to be. It wasn't really a suggestion, and Derek seemed to understand that immediately. He stood shakily, fumbling for his wallet while avoiding eye contact with anyone at the table. The transformation from aggressive bully to cowering child would have been laughable if it hadn't been so revealing about the kind of man he really was. Bullies, Catalina realized, were always cowards when faced with someone more powerful. After Derek skulked away, escorted firmly but politely to the front door by Marco, Dante turned his attention to Catalina. She was still standing beside the abandoned table, her order pad clutched in white-knuckled fingers, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. Up close, he could see the slight tremor in her hands and the way she kept glancing toward the exit as if expecting Derek to return. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his voice softer now, but no less compelling. The question seemed to break through her shock, and she looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "I think so," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Dante said simply. "No one should have to endure that kind of treatment, especially not in my family's restaurant." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm Dante Romano." "And you are?" "Catalina Martinez," she managed, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I work here." "I know," he said with the ghost of a smile. "I've been watching you work all evening. You're very good at what you do." The compliment sent unexpected warmth through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in months under Derek's constant criticism. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of routine tasks and racing thoughts. Dante had returned to his table, but Catalina remained hyper-aware of his presence. Every time she glanced in his direction, she found him watching her with those penetrating eyes, not in a way that felt intrusive but rather protective, as if he was making sure she remained safe. When her shift finally ended at midnight, she was surprised to find him waiting by the front entrance. "Miss Martinez," he said as she emerged from the back room in her street clothes. "I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to make sure you got home safely. I'm concerned your friend might be waiting for you." The thoughtfulness of the gesture nearly brought tears to her eyes. When was the last time someone had shown genuine concern for her well-being without expecting something in return? Derek's protection always came with conditions, obligations, debts to be repaid through compliance and submission. This felt different, freely given without strings attached. "I'll be fine," she said automatically, the response trained into her by Derek's insistence that she never accept help from other men. "Thank you, but I can take care of myself." Dante nodded, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. He handed her a business card, simple black cardstock with only a phone number embossed in silver. "If you need anything," he said quietly. "Anything at all, call that number." As she walked to her car, Catalina felt the weight of his gaze following her until she was safely inside with the doors locked. The business card felt warm in her palm, like a lifeline she wasn't sure she was brave enough to use. She knew without question that Derek would be waiting for her at home, and his earlier promise echoed in her mind with terrifying certainty. "You're done when we get home." For the first time in months, however, she wasn't facing that threat entirely alone. She had a choice now, even if she wasn't sure she was strong enough to make it. As she pulled out of the restaurant parking lot, she caught sight of Dante still standing by the entrance, his silhouette powerful and reassuring against the warm light spilling from Romano's windows. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment her life would finally change. Whether she'd been living in Chicago your whole life or you're new to the city, you've probably felt that moment when you realize you're not as safe as you thought. Have you ever been in a situation where a stranger's intervention changed everything? That feeling of being caught between the danger you know and the unknown protection being offered? Sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the threat you can see coming, but the decision to trust someone powerful enough to make that threat disappear. The drive home felt like a countdown to execution. Catalina's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white, and she found herself taking the longest possible route through Chicago's late-night streets. Every red light felt like a reprieve, every green light like a step closer to whatever punishment Derek had planned. The business card Dante had given her seemed to burn against her palm, where she'd clutched it since leaving the restaurant. But the rational part of her mind kept insisting it was impossible to accept help from a stranger, no matter how compelling his offer had been. Her phone buzzed against the passenger seat, and Derek's name flashed across the screen like a warning. She let it ring through to voicemail, then buzzed again immediately. And again. By the fourth call, her hands were shaking so badly she had to pull over into a gas station parking lot just to avoid an accident. The voicemail notification showed 7 missed calls and a growing number of text messages that she was afraid to read. Finally, she forced herself to check the latest message. "Where are you?" was followed 30 seconds later by "You better not be ignoring me. Then get home now." The progression was familiar and terrifying, each message a step up the ladder of his anger until she could practically feel his rage radiating through the phone screen. She was staring at the messages when an unknown number flashed across her screen. For a moment, panic seized her as she wondered if Derek had somehow gotten access to another phone. But the voice that answered when she hesitantly picked up was calm and unmistakably familiar. "Miss Martinez." Dante's voice carried clearly through the connection, formal but warm. "I apologize for calling so late, but I wanted to make sure you arrived safely. Are you all right?" The concern in his tone nearly undid her. When was the last time someone had called simply to check on her well-being? Derek's calls were always demands or accusations, never genuine worry about her safety. She found herself blinking back sudden tears as she struggled to find her voice. "I'm okay," she managed, though her voice betrayed her with a slight tremor. "I'm almost home." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and she could almost hear him thinking. "Forgive me if I'm overstepping," he said carefully, "but you don't sound okay. And based on what I witnessed tonight, I'm concerned about what you might be facing when you arrive home." Catalina closed her eyes, leaning back against the headrest of her car. The parking lot around her was mostly empty, just a few late-night travelers stopping for gas and energy drinks. The normalcy of it felt surreal compared to the chaos her life had become. Part of her wanted to tell Dante everything, to pour out the months of escalating control and subtle threats that had brought her to this moment. But the larger part, the part Derek had carefully trained through months of isolation and criticism, insisted she could handle this herself. "I appreciate your concern," she said finally, "but this is something I need to deal with on my own. Derek and we just need to talk things through." Even as she said the words, she knew how hollow they sounded. Derek wasn't interested in talking through anything. He was interested in punishment, in reasserting the control he felt had been challenged by Dante's intervention at the restaurant. The certainty of what awaited her sat like a stone in her stomach, but accepting help from a stranger felt even more dangerous than facing Derek's anger. "Miss Martinez," Dante said quietly, and something in his tone made her listen more carefully. "I've been around long enough to recognize certain patterns of behavior. The way he spoke to you tonight, the threats he made, those aren't the actions of a man who's simply having a bad evening. They're the actions of someone who believes he owns you." The words hit her like a physical blow because they were so accurate it took her breath away. That was exactly how Derek saw their relationship, she realized. Not as a partnership between equals, but as ownership. She was an asset he'd invested in, and assets that didn't perform according to expectations needed to be corrected. "I know we've only just met," Dante continued, his voice gentle but insistent. "But I'm offering you an alternative. You don't have to go home tonight. You don't have to face whatever he has planned. My penthouse has security, safety, and you would be completely protected there. No obligations, no expectations beyond giving yourself time to think clearly about what you want your future to look like." The offer hung in the air between them like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. Catalina wanted to accept so badly it made her chest ache, but the voice Derek had spent months cultivating in her mind immediately began its familiar litany of objections. She couldn't trust a stranger. She'd be putting herself in even more danger. What kind of man offered shelter to women he'd just met? What would he expect in return? "I can't," she whispered, hating how small her voice sounded. "I don't even know you. How do I know you're not just as dangerous as what I'm trying to avoid?" It was a fair question, and Dante seemed to appreciate her caution rather than being offended by it. "You're right to be careful," he agreed. "You don't know me, and trust has to be earned. But I can tell you this. I have never in my life raised a hand to a woman, and I never will. Violence against those who can't defend themselves is the mark of a coward, and I have no tolerance for cowards." There was something in the way he said it, a conviction that went bone deep, that made her believe him. Perhaps it was the controlled fury she'd witnessed when Derek had threatened her, or the gentle way he'd spoken to her afterward. Or maybe it was simply desperation making her grasp for any option that didn't involve going home to face Derek's punishment. Her phone buzzed with another text from Derek, and this time the message was clear and terrifying. "I know you're sitting in that parking lot on 5th Street. Come home now, or I'm coming to get you." The blood drained from her face as she realized he was tracking her location somehow. Of course he was. Derek was nothing if not thorough when it came to maintaining control. He probably had access to her phone's GPS, her credit cards, possibly even her car's navigation system. The technological leash she hadn't even known existed suddenly felt like a noose tightening around her throat. "He knows where I am," she said into the phone, her voice barely audible. "He's been tracking me somehow. He knows I'm not coming home." "Stay exactly where you are," Dante said, and his voice carried a new edge of command that made her feel somehow safer even as her situation grew more dangerous. "Marco and I are 15 minutes away. Don't move. Don't answer your phone if he calls, and don't let anyone approach your car. Do you understand?" "Yes," she managed, though her heart was racing so fast she felt lightheaded. The relief of having someone else take charge, someone who sounded completely confident in his ability to handle the situation, was overwhelming. For months, she'd been carrying the weight of Derek's moods and demands entirely alone, walking on eggshells and managing his temper like it was a full-time job. The possibility of sharing that burden, even temporarily, felt like being offered oxygen after nearly drowning. The next 15 minutes felt like hours. Derek called 6 more times, and each unanswered call seemed to ratchet up his fury based on the increasingly violent text messages that followed. By the time she saw headlights approaching the parking lot, she was shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. But when the black Mercedes pulled up beside her car and Dante stepped out, some of the panic subsided. He moved with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd handled much more dangerous situations than an angry boyfriend, and his presence alone made the parking lot feel safer. Marco remained in the driver's seat while Dante approached her car, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible like someone who understood the importance of not startling someone already on edge. When she rolled down her window, he crouched down to her level, bringing himself to her height rather than looming over her. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning her face as if checking for injuries. "No," she said, though her voice still shook. "He hasn't. He doesn't usually hit me. It's more psychological than physical." Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she got the impression that distinction didn't make Derek's behavior any less unforgivable in his mind. "Psychological abuse can be just as damaging as physical violence," he said. "Sometimes more so, because the wounds don't show." The understanding in his voice told her he'd seen this kind of situation before, and his matter-of-fact acknowledgement of what she'd been enduring felt like validation she hadn't realized she desperately needed. Derek had spent months convincing her that his behavior was normal, that all relationships required compromise and adjustment, that her discomfort was just proof of her own selfishness and immaturity. "I want to accept your offer," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before her fear could stop them. "But I'm scared. What if he comes looking for me? What if I'm just making everything worse?" "Derek Mitchell has no idea who I am or where I live," Dante replied calmly. "And even if he did, he wouldn't be brave enough to try anything. Men like Derek are only dangerous when they feel in control. Take that control away, and they collapse like the cowards they really are." There was something reassuring about his certainty, the way he spoke about Derek like he was a problem that could be solved rather than an unavoidable force of nature. For so long, she'd felt like Derek's moods and demands were weather systems she had to navigate, unpredictable and beyond her control. The possibility that someone could simply neutralize that threat felt too good to be true. "My penthouse takes up the entire top floor of the Millennium Tower," Dante explained. 24-hour security, private elevator access, and views of the entire city. You'll have your own room, your own bathroom, and complete privacy. I travel frequently for business, so you'll often have the entire space to yourself. All I ask in return is that you give yourself time to think clearly about what you want your life to look like without Derek Mitchell in it." The offer was more generous than anything she could have imagined, and the lack of conditions or expectations made it feel genuine rather than manipulative. She'd been expecting some kind of quid pro quo, some hint that his protection would come at a cost she wasn't prepared to pay. Instead, he seemed to simply want to help, with no agenda beyond keeping her safe. "Okay," she said finally, the word coming out stronger than she'd expected. "I accept. Thank you." The relief that flooded through her was so intense, it left her feeling dizzy. For the first time in months, she didn't have to go home to face Derek's anger. She didn't have to spend the night walking on eggshells and calculating which responses might minimize his fury. Someone else was handling the situation. Someone who seemed genuinely capable of protecting her from whatever Derek might try to do. "Marco will follow us to make sure we're not being tracked," Dante said as she gathered her purse and jacket from the car. "We'll have someone retrieve your belongings tomorrow when it's safe." As she locked her car and walked toward his Mercedes, Catalina felt like she was stepping across a threshold into an entirely different life. The man holding open the passenger door for her was still essentially a stranger, but something about his steady presence and protective instincts made her feel safer than she had in her own home for months. Whatever happened next, at least she wouldn't be facing it alone. The drive through Chicago's late-night streets felt different from the passenger seat of Dante's Mercedes. The leather seats were butter-soft, the interior was warm and quiet, and classical music played softly through speakers that must have cost more than her monthly rent. But more than the luxury, it was the absence of tension that struck her most. For the first time in months, she wasn't calculating her words or monitoring someone else's mood. She was simply a passenger being driven to safety, no performance required. As the Millennium Tower came into view, rising like a beacon of glass and steel against the night sky, Catalina realized she was about to enter a world completely foreign to her experience. But for the first time in months, that unknown felt like possibility rather than threat. Catalina awoke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Chicago she'd never seen before. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. The bed beneath her was impossibly soft. The sheets were Egyptian cotton with a thread count that probably exceeded her monthly salary, and the silence was so complete it felt almost alien after months of tiptoeing around Derek's unpredictable moods. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back, and with them a mixture of relief and anxiety that made her stomach clench. She was safe, protected in Dante Romano's penthouse high above the city, but she was also completely out of her element in a world of wealth and power she'd only glimpsed from the outside. The guest room he'd shown her to was larger than her entire apartment, with its own marble bathroom, walk-in closet, and sitting area arranged around a fireplace that probably cost more than her car. The clothes she'd thrown on in her rush to leave the restaurant felt wrinkled and inappropriate in such elegant surroundings, but they were all she had until someone could safely retrieve her belongings. Dante had been a perfect gentleman the night before, showing her to the guest room and explaining how the various electronic systems worked before bidding her goodnight with the same formal courtesy he might show any house guest. But now, in the harsh light of morning, she found herself questioning the wisdom of accepting shelter from a man she barely knew. The scent of coffee and something that smelled remarkably like homemade pancakes drew her from the bedroom toward what she assumed must be the kitchen. The penthouse was even more impressive by daylight. All clean lines and expensive materials arranged with the kind of understated elegance that whispered rather than shouted about money. Original artwork hung on the walls, and she was fairly certain the sculpture in the foyer was a genuine piece she'd seen reproduced in art history textbooks. She found Dante in the kitchen, and the sight stopped her in her tracks. Gone was the intimidating figure in the expensive suit who'd faced down Derek with such quiet authority. Instead, she found a man in dark jeans and a soft gray sweater, moving around the kitchen with easy familiarity as he tended to something sizzling in a professional-grade pan. His dark hair was slightly mussed, and there was something surprisingly domestic about watching him cook that made him seem more human and less like the untouchable figure of power she'd built up in her mind. "Good morning," he said, glancing up with a smile that transformed his entire face. "I hope you slept well. I thought you might be hungry." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. She'd grown so accustomed to Derek's morning moods, the careful assessment of his expression to gauge what kind of day lay ahead, that simple courtesy without conditions felt like a gift. "I slept better than I have in months," she admitted, then immediately wondered if that revelation said too much about her previous living situation. I'm glad, Dante replied, and something in his tone suggested he understood exactly what she'd left unsaid. Sit, please. Breakfast is almost ready. The kitchen island was set for two, with real china and cloth napkins, another small luxury that reminded her how far she was from her normal world. She perched on one of the bar stools and watched him work, fascinated despite herself by the competent way he moved around the space. Everything about the scene felt surreal, as if she'd stepped into someone else's life where powerful men made breakfast and offered protection without expecting anything in return. You cook, she observed, unable to keep the surprise out of her voice. Dante's mouth quirked up in genuine amusement. My mother would disown me if I couldn't feed myself properly. She made sure all her sons learned their way around a kitchen before she'd let us leave home. He plated what turned out to be perfect pancakes alongside fresh berries and crispy bacon, setting the plate in front of her with the same care he might use for a business presentation. The food was better than anything she'd eaten in a restaurant, and she found herself eating with more appetite than she'd had in weeks. Derek had opinions about everything she put in her mouth, a running commentary on calories and appearance, and how her choices reflected on him as her boyfriend. Eating without that constant judgment felt like another small act of rebellion. This is incredible, she said between bites. Where did you learn to cook like this? My mother and my grandmother, Dante replied, settling onto the stool across from her with his own plate. In our family, food is love. My grandmother used to say that anyone who couldn't cook couldn't properly take care of the people they cared about. There was something in the way he said, our family, that made her curious, but before she could ask what he meant, he continued speaking. Tell me about yourself, Catalina. What did you study before you left school? The question was casual enough, but she sensed genuine interest behind it rather than polite small talk. Northwestern, she said. Business administration with a minor in art history. I wanted to work in museum curation eventually, maybe for the Art Institute. Past tense, he noted gently. What changed your mind? The familiar shame washed over her as she remembered Derek's carefully constructed arguments about the impracticality of her dreams, the financial burden of continuing school, the selfishness of pursuing something so frivolous when they could be building a life together. She'd let him convince her that her ambitions were childish fantasies, that real adults made practical choices. My boyfriend thought it was unrealistic, she said finally, then caught herself. My ex-boyfriend, I mean. He convinced me that art history was a luxury I couldn't afford, and business school wasn't preparing me for anything practical. He was probably right. Dante's expression darkened almost imperceptibly, and she realized she'd said something that had genuinely angered him. Catalina, he said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up from her plate. A man who tries to kill a woman's dreams isn't protecting her future. He's stealing it. The words hit her with unexpected force because they articulated something she'd been trying not to think about for months. Derek hadn't just discouraged her education. He'd systematically dismantled her confidence in her own judgment and aspirations. Every decision had become filtered through his opinions and preferences until she'd lost track of what she actually wanted versus what would keep him happy. He said he was trying to help me be realistic, she said, but even as the words left her mouth, they sounded hollow. He said I was living in a fantasy world. And what do you say? Dante asked, leaning forward slightly. When you strip away his voice in your head, what do you want? The question caught her off guard because no one had asked her that in so long, she'd almost forgotten how to access her own desires. She found herself thinking about the hours she'd spent in museums before Derek, the way her heart raced when she discovered a new piece or learned about an artist's technique. The dreams she'd had of working with collections, of helping preserve and share humanity's creative heritage. I want to finish my degree, she said slowly, the words feeling strange in her mouth after so many months of silence. I want to work with art, help people discover pieces they've never seen before. I want to travel and see the originals of paintings I've only studied in books. Then do it, Dante said simply, as if the obstacles that had seemed insurmountable for months could be swept away with decision alone. Life is too short to live someone else's version of practicality. But the loans, the cost of living, she started, then stopped as she realized she was echoing Derek's arguments. The same objections he'd used to convince her to abandon school and move in with him. accepting his financial support in exchange for increasing control over her choices and freedom. Those are problems that can be solved, Dante replied. What can't be solved is the regret of never trying, of letting someone else's fears dictate your life. There was something liberating about the way he talked about problems as things to be solved rather than insurmountable barriers. Derek had presented every obstacle as proof that her dreams were impossible, but Dante seemed to view them as temporary inconveniences that could be overcome with the right resources and determination. Their conversation was interrupted by the soft chime of Dante's phone, and she watched his expression shift subtly as he read the message. "Everything all right?" she asked, recognizing the change in his demeanor. "Marco's letting me know that your boyfriend has been calling the restaurant, trying to find out where you are," Dante replied, setting the phone aside. He also tried to file a missing persons report, but the police informed him that adults have the right to leave without explanation. Relief and anxiety warred in her chest as she processed this information. Part of her was grateful that Derek couldn't simply drag her back through official channels, but another part worried about what he might try next. Derek didn't handle rejection well, and losing control over her would only make him more desperate and potentially dangerous. Dante seemed to read her thoughts in her expression. "You don't have to worry about him reaching you here," he said calmly. "Building security has been instructed not to allow anyone up without explicit permission from me, and they take their jobs very seriously." "What exactly do you do?" she asked suddenly, the question that had been building since the moment he'd intervened at the restaurant. "I know Romano's is your family's restaurant, but that doesn't explain the security or the way people respond to you." Dante was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him considering how much to tell her. "My family has been in Chicago for 4 generations, he said finally. "We started with the restaurant, but over the years we've diversified into other businesses. Import and export, real estate development, private security consulting. Some of our ventures operate in areas where discretion is valuable, which is why security is a priority." It was a careful answer that told her enough to understand the broad strokes, while leaving the specifics deliberately vague. She wasn't naive enough to think that his influence and the deference he commanded came from legitimate businesses alone, but she also sensed that he was trying to protect her from details that might frighten her away. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked quietly, watching her process his explanation. She considered the question seriously, examining her feelings rather than giving the automatic response Derek would have expected. "I should be," she said finally. "Everything logical tells me I should be terrified, but I'm not. When you're around, I feel safer than I have in months." The admission surprised her with its honesty, but it was true. Despite not knowing the full extent of what he did or who he really was, her instincts trusted him in a way they'd stopped trusting Derek long before she'd been willing to acknowledge it consciously. "Good," Dante said, and his smile held a warmth that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Because I would never do anything to hurt you, Catalina. That's a promise." Later that afternoon, as she sat curled in the window seat of the guest room with a book from his extensive library, she found herself watching him work at his desk in the adjacent office. He was on a conference call that seemed to involve shipping schedules and warehouse capacities, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that suggested people hung on his every word. There was something mesmerizing about watching him in his element, seeing the mind that had built this empire of legitimate and not-so-legitimate enterprises. When his call ended, he appeared in the doorway of the guest room with a concerned expression. "Marco needs me to handle something at the docks," he said. "I should be back by dinner, but I wanted to make sure you're comfortable here alone." The thoughtfulness of checking with her rather than simply leaving struck her as another small kindness. Derek had come and gone as he pleased, often without explanation, leaving her to wonder when he'd return and what mood he'd be in when he did. "I'll be fine," she assured him. "Thank you for thinking to ask." As the afternoon wore on and the penthouse grew quiet around her, Catalina found herself thinking about Dante's question from breakfast. When she stripped away Derek's voice in her head, what did she want? For months, she'd been so focused on managing his moods and expectations that she'd lost touch with her own desires and ambitions. But here, in this peaceful space high above the city, she could almost remember the woman she'd been before Derek's slow campaign of erosion had worn away her confidence. She wanted to finish school. She wanted to work with art again. She wanted to travel and learn and grow in ways Derek had convinced her were selfish and impractical. Most of all, she wanted to feel safe in her own skin, to trust her instincts and make choices based on what would make her happy rather than what would prevent someone else's anger. The realization that those things felt possible again, that Dante's protection had created a space where she could even imagine them, filled her with a cautious hope she'd thought was gone forever. Dante returned that evening with a tension in his shoulders that Catalina had learned to recognize, the weight of decisions and responsibilities that shaped his days in ways she was only beginning to understand. She'd spent the afternoon exploring his extensive library, losing herself in art books that detailed collections she'd only dreamed of seeing in person. When she heard his key in the lock, she was curled up on the leather sofa with a volume about Renaissance painters, completely absorbed in studying the brushwork techniques of masters whose names she'd whispered like prayers in her art history classes. "How was your day?" she asked, looking up as he entered the living area. Something in his expression made her close the book and give him her full attention. "Complicated," he replied, loosening his tie with movements that suggested fatigue beyond the physical. He poured himself 2 fingers of what looked like expensive whiskey from a crystal decanter, then paused. "Would you like anything? Wine, coffee?" "Wine sounds good," she said, though she was more interested in the shadows behind his eyes than in alcohol. He'd been unfailingly courteous and protective since she'd arrived, but this was the first time she'd seen him with his professional mask slipping, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the careful control. He returned with a glass of red wine that probably cost more than she'd spent on alcohol in the past year, settling onto the opposite end of the sofa with his whiskey. For a few minutes they sat in comfortable silence, and she found herself studying his profile in the soft lighting. He was undeniably handsome in a way that spoke of good genetics and careful maintenance, but it was the intelligence in his green-gray eyes that truly captivated her. Derek was attractive in a conventional sense, but his beauty felt superficial compared to the depth she sensed in Dante. "Tell me about your family," she said finally, curious about the people who had shaped this complex man. "You mentioned your mother and grandmother earlier, but I get the sense there's more to the story." Dante's laugh held little humor. "My family is both blessing and burden," he replied, taking a sip of his whiskey. 4 generations of Romano men have built what we have today, and each generation has paid a price for that success. My father died when I was 25, and I inherited not just his business interests but also his enemies, his obligations, and his expectations for what the Romano name should represent. There was something in his voice that suggested those expectations weighed heavily on him, and Catalina found herself leaning forward despite her natural caution about prying into his private life. "What kind of expectations?" she asked gently. "Strength above all else," Dante said, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. "Never show weakness, never back down. Never let anyone see that you're anything less than completely in control. A Romano man protects what's his and eliminates threats before they can grow dangerous. We don't have the luxury of ordinary relationships or simple choices." The loneliness in his words struck her like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on her own isolation under Derek's control that she hadn't considered how isolating power might be in its own way. Derek had cut her off from friends and family through manipulation and emotional blackmail, but Dante seemed to have been isolated by responsibility and the dangerous nature of his position. "That sounds exhausting," she said quietly, and something in her tone made him look at her directly for the first time since he'd sat down. "It is," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice suggested he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge that truth. "I haven't had a normal conversation with someone outside my organization in years. Everyone wants something from me, or they're afraid of me, or they're trying to calculate how to use me for their own purposes. You're the first person in longer than I can remember who talks to me like I'm just a man." The vulnerability in his confession made her chest tighten with an emotion she wasn't ready to examine too closely. She wanted to comfort him, to ease the loneliness that radiated from him despite his obvious strength and success. Without thinking, she shifted closer on the sofa, close enough that she could see the exhaustion lines around his eyes and smell the subtle cologne that had become familiar over the past few days. "You are just a man," she said softly. "A powerful man, a dangerous man maybe, but still just a man who makes breakfast and worries about the people he cares about. The way he looked at her then made her breath catch in her throat. It was as if her words had stripped away some essential barrier, revealing depths of longing and need that he'd kept carefully hidden. For a moment, the space between them felt charged with possibility, with the recognition of two people who had been lonely in different ways finding unexpected connection. "Catalina," he said, her name carrying a weight of meaning that made her pulse quicken. "I need you to understand something about me, about what I do and why I can't walk away from it. The choices I make, the actions I take to protect the people I care about, they're not always choices other people would make. Sometimes they're not even choices I want to make. But they're necessary." She studied his face, seeing the conflict there between his desire to protect her and his need to be honest about who he really was. "I'm not naive, Dante," she replied. "I know your world isn't ordinary or safe. But I also know that you saved me from something that was destroying me slowly. Derek never physically hurt me, but he was killing who I was piece by piece. You gave me back the possibility of being myself again." The gratitude in her voice seemed to surprise him, and she realized that he'd been expecting her to be frightened away by his confession rather than drawing closer because of it. Perhaps people in his position were accustomed to being valued for what they could provide rather than who they were beneath the power and responsibility. Their conversation was interrupted by the sharp buzz of his phone, and she watched his expression shift instantly from vulnerable to alert as he read the message. "What is it?" she asked, recognizing the change in his demeanor. "Derek has been spotted in the building's parking garage," Dante said, his voice taking on the cold efficiency she'd heard when he'd confronted her ex-boyfriend at the restaurant. "Security is handling it, but we need to move you away from the windows until he's gone." Fear and anger warred in her chest as she processed this information. Part of her was terrified that Derek had found her despite all of Dante's precautions, but another part was furious that he was still trying to control her even after she'd made her choice to leave. The man who had spent months convincing her she was helpless and dependent was now proving exactly how capable she was by the lengths he was going to in order to get her back. "How did he find me?" she asked, allowing Dante to guide her away from the floor-to-ceiling windows toward an interior hallway. "Probably through your phone or credit cards," Dante replied grimly. "Men like Derek are often more technologically sophisticated than they appear. Marco is working on tracing his access and cutting off his sources, but for now we assume he can track your digital footprint." The idea that Derek had been monitoring her location and activities even before their confrontation at the restaurant made her feel violated in a way she hadn't expected. How long had he been tracking her movements, reading her messages, watching her through electronic eyes she hadn't even known existed? The relationship she'd thought was built on love and shared goals had apparently been surveillance and control from the beginning. "I feel so stupid," she said, sinking onto a chair in what appeared to be a home office. "How did I not see it? How did I let myself become so completely monitored?" Dante crouched down in front of her chair, bringing himself to her eye level with the same careful attention to non-threatening positioning she'd noticed that first night. "You're not stupid," he said firmly. "You're a trusting person who believed someone when they said they loved you. That's not a character flaw, Catalina. That's what makes you beautiful." The sincerity in his voice, combined with the gentle way he was looking at her, made tears prick at the corners of her eyes. When was the last time someone had called her beautiful and meant it as more than just a comment on her physical appearance? Derek's compliments had always felt performative, designed to keep her compliant rather than to express genuine admiration. "I don't feel beautiful," she whispered. "I feel used and foolish and afraid that I'll never be able to trust my own judgment again." Dante's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking gently across her skin in a gesture that felt both protective and achingly tender. "You survived something designed to break you," he said quietly. "You recognized that you deserved better, and you made the choice to leave, even when it meant accepting help from a stranger. That takes courage most people don't have." The warmth of his touch and the conviction in his voice made something tight in her chest begin to loosen. For months, Derek had convinced her that her discomfort with his behavior was proof of her own inadequacy, her failure to appreciate what he was doing for her. But Dante's perspective reframed her experience entirely, casting her not as a victim of her own poor judgment, but as a survivor who had found the strength to escape. His phone buzzed again, and he read the message with an expression of grim satisfaction. Derek has been removed from the property and issued a formal trespass warning, he reported. Building security has his photo and instructions to contact police immediately if he returns. Relief flooded through her so intensely it left her feeling weak. For a moment, she'd been afraid that Derek's persistence would somehow override all of Dante's protections, that she'd be dragged back into the life she'd finally found the courage to leave. The knowledge that he'd been turned away, that there were people whose job it was to keep him away from her, felt like another small victory in the process of reclaiming her autonomy. "Thank you," she said, but the words felt inadequate for what he'd given her. Not just safety, but the space to remember who she'd been before Derek and the possibility of becoming someone even stronger. Dante's hand was still cradling her cheek, and she found herself leaning into the touch without conscious decision. The gesture felt natural and right in a way that physical contact with Derek never had. Even in the early days of their relationship, when she'd convinced herself she was happy. With Dante, there was no calculation required, no careful monitoring of his mood to determine whether affection would be welcomed or rejected. "Catalina," Dante said softly, and something in his voice made her look directly into his eyes. "There's something happening between us, something I wasn't expecting when I offered you protection. I want you to know that my help doesn't come with conditions or expectations, but I also can't pretend I don't care about you in ways that go beyond simple charity." Her heart began racing as she processed his words, the careful honesty with which he was laying out his feelings without pressuring her for a response. After months of Derek's emotional manipulation and hidden agendas, Dante's straightforward communication felt like a revelation. He was telling her exactly where he stood, while making it clear that her feelings and choices were entirely her own. "I care about you too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than I should probably care about someone I've known for such a short time. You make me feel safe in a way I'd forgotten was possible." The admission seemed to affect him deeply, and she could see the careful control he usually maintained beginning to slip. When he leaned forward, closing the distance between them with movements that gave her every opportunity to pull away, she found herself meeting him halfway. The first brush of his lips against hers was gentle, questioning, a request rather than a demand. She'd been kissed many times before, but never with such careful attention to her comfort and response. Derek's kisses had been possessive from the beginning, designed to stake claim rather than create connection. But Dante kissed her like she was precious, like her pleasure and participation mattered more than his own desires. When she responded by pressing closer and sliding her fingers into his hair, she felt rather than heard the soft sound he made in response. He deepened the kiss slowly, thoroughly, like he had all the time in the world and intended to savor every moment. His hands remained respectfully positioned, one still cupping her cheek and the other resting lightly on her waist, holding her close without making her feel trapped or overwhelmed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than before, she found herself studying his face with new eyes. The controlled businessman was gone, replaced by a man whose carefully maintained walls had cracked enough to reveal the depth of feeling underneath. She could see desire there, but also something deeper and more complex, something that made her chest tight with possibilities she wasn't quite ready to name. "This changes things," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure if she was stating a fact or asking a question. "Only if you want it to," Dante replied, his voice rough with barely restrained emotion. "I meant what I said about no expectations, Catalina. Whatever happens between us happens because you choose it, not because you feel obligated or grateful." The fact that he was giving her choice, real choice without pressure or manipulation, made her want him even more. For so long, her desires had been secondary to Derek's needs and moods that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to want something purely for herself. But sitting here with Dante's hands still gentle on her skin and his eyes dark with carefully controlled desire, she knew exactly what she wanted. "I want this," she said, her voice stronger now with certainty. "I want you." What followed was a slow exploration of touch and sensation that felt like coming home to herself after a long exile. Dante's careful attention to her responses, the way he checked in with her at each stage of increased intimacy, the obvious priority he placed on her comfort and pleasure, all combined to create an experience unlike anything she'd known before. This was what intimacy was supposed to feel like, she realized. Not performance or obligation, but genuine connection between two people who chose each other freely. Later, as they lay together in the aftermath of passion that had been both tender and consuming, Catalina found herself tracing patterns on Dante's chest while his fingers combed gently through her hair. The contentment she felt was so foreign after months of walking on eggshells that she almost couldn't believe it was real. "Are you all right?" Dante asked quietly, and she could hear genuine concern in his voice despite the satisfaction she could see in his expression. "I'm perfect," she replied, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she meant it completely. In his arms, protected and cherished rather than controlled and diminished, she felt like herself again. Only better, stronger, more complete than she'd been even before Derek. Outside the penthouse windows, Chicago glittered in the darkness like a promise of all the possibilities that lay ahead. And for the first time since accepting Dante's protection, Catalina felt truly ready to claim them. 3 weeks had passed since Derek's failed attempt to reach her at the Millennium Tower, and Catalina had begun to believe that maybe he'd finally given up. She and Dante had settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural, sharing meals and conversations that revealed new depths to his character every day. He was nothing like the cold, calculating figure Derek had tried to convince her all-powerful men must be. Instead, she discovered someone who read voraciously, who remembered her coffee preferences without being asked, and who listened to her thoughts about art and literature with genuine interest rather than condescending patience. That afternoon, they'd planned to visit the Art Institute together, something that had become a weekly tradition since she'd mentioned missing the galleries. Dante seemed to enjoy watching her enthusiasm as she explained techniques and historical context, and she loved seeing the city's cultural treasures through his eyes. He had an unexpected appreciation for beauty in all its forms, and his questions revealed a sharp intelligence that had been educated far beyond what business necessities required. She was getting dressed for their outing, choosing a blue dress that brought out her eyes and that Dante had complimented before when her phone rang. The number was unknown, but something made her answer despite her usual caution about unfamiliar calls. "Miss Martinez." The voice was professional and unfamiliar. "This is Detective Sarachon with Chicago PD. I'm calling about Derek Mitchell." Catalina's blood ran cold as worst-case scenarios flooded her mind. Had Derek hurt someone? Had he convinced police that she was missing against her will? Her hand tightened on the phone as she tried to keep her voice steady. "What about Derek Mitchell?" "Mr. Mitchell has been making increasingly concerning statements about his intent to contact you," Detective Chin continued. "He's hired a private investigator and has been asking questions around your former workplace and neighborhood. While his actions haven't risen to the level of criminal stalking yet, we wanted to make you aware of the situation." The relief that he hadn't hurt anyone was quickly replaced by renewed fear. If Derek was desperate enough to hire professional help to find her, his obsession was escalating beyond what she'd imagined possible. She'd hoped that the security at Dante's building and the weeks of silence meant he was moving on, but apparently his need for control had only been temporarily frustrated. "Has he found out where I'm staying?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "We have reason to believe he has your current address," Detective Chin replied grimly. "The private investigator he hired has been conducting surveillance in the area around the Millennium Tower. We've contacted building security, but I wanted to warn you personally to take extra precautions." After Detective Chun hung up, Catalina sat on the edge of the bed trying to process the information. Just when she'd started to feel truly safe, when she'd begun to imagine a future free from Derek's shadow, the threat was escalating again. She'd been naive to think he would simply give up and move on. Men like Derek didn't release control easily, especially when that control had been taken away by someone they viewed as a rival. Dante appeared in the doorway of the guest room, took one look at her expression, and immediately shifted into protective mode. "What happened?" he asked, crossing to sit beside her with the careful attention to her emotional state she'd come to expect from him. She explained the detective's call, watching his expression grow increasingly grim as she related the news about the private investigator and Derek's escalating behavior. By the time she finished, Dante's jaw was set in a way she'd learned to associate with barely controlled fury. Marco and Alessandro need to know about this immediately, he said, already reaching for his phone. We're moving you to a safe house until this is resolved permanently. The finality in his tone made her stomach clench with anxiety. She'd known this moment would come eventually, when Derek's persistence would force Dante to take more decisive action, but she'd hoped they'd have more time to develop whatever was growing between them before his dangerous world intruded completely. What does resolved permanently mean? She asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dante's pause told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. Derek Mitchell has escalated beyond the point where warnings and legal intervention will be effective, he said carefully. He's hired professionals, which means he's committed to continuing this pursuit regardless of the consequences. That kind of obsession only ends one way unless it's stopped definitively. The implication hung in the air between them like a blade. Catalina had always known that Dante's protection might eventually require violence. But the abstract possibility was very different from the concrete reality of having someone eliminated because of her. The rational part of her mind understood that Derek's escalation left few alternatives, but the part of her that had never lived in a world where problems were solved through violence struggled with the moral weight of the decision. Before she could respond, Dante's phone rang with an incoming call from Marco. She watched his expression change as he listened to whatever his lieutenant was telling him, seeing the controlled businessman replaced by someone harder and more dangerous. Romanos, Dante said when he hung up, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. Derek is at Romano's restaurant with what Marco believes are hired security. He's demanding to speak with me about returning my property. The casual way Derek had referred to her as property made Catalina's hands clench into fists, but it was the violation of their special place that truly enraged her. Romano's wasn't just where Derek had first threatened her. It had become symbolic of her new life with Dante, the place where he'd saved her, and where they'd shared quiet dinners that felt like glimpses of a normal relationship. He's using the restaurant as leverage, she said, understanding Derek's strategy with sickening clarity. He knows it matters to you, so he's making it the battlefield. Exactly, Dante replied grimly. And he's put innocent people at risk to force this confrontation. That changes everything. The drive to Romano's felt like traveling toward an inevitable collision. Dante had called in his full security team, and the streets around the restaurant had been quietly surrounded by men who looked like ordinary pedestrians but moved with the coordinated precision of military operations. Catalina sat in the passenger seat of Dante's Mercedes, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. This would end tonight, one way or another. Marco met them 2 blocks away from the restaurant, his expression grim as he briefed Dante on the situation. Derek was inside with 3 men who were almost certainly armed private security contractors. The restaurant had been cleared of most customers, but the evening shift staff was still inside, effectively held hostage by Derek's presence and implied threats. He's demanding that Catalina come inside to talk, Marco reported. Says he just wants to have a conversation about their relationship and work things out like adults. The transparent manipulation of the request made Dante's jaw clench visibly. Derek knew that any reasonable person would refuse to send Catalina into a dangerous situation, which would give him the justification to escalate further and potentially harm the innocent staff members caught in the middle. I'm going in, Catalina said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. This started because of me, and I won't let other people get hurt because Derek can't accept that it's over. Absolutely not. Dante replied immediately, his tone leaving no room for argument. You're not going anywhere near that restaurant while he's inside it. But if I don't, he'll hurt the staff, she protested. You know he will. He's desperate enough to hire professionals and take hostages. He won't just give up and leave. Dante turned to face her fully, his green-gray eyes intense with emotion she was still learning to read. Catalina, he said quietly, you need to trust me to handle this. The way I handle threats to people I care about isn't always pretty, and it isn't always legal, but it's effective. Can you accept that? The question was about more than just this specific situation, she realized. He was asking whether she could truly accept who he was and what his protection meant in practice, not just in theory. All the conversations about his dangerous world and necessary choices came down to this moment, when she had to decide whether she could trust him completely even when his methods might horrify her. Looking into his eyes, Seeing the conflict there between his desire to shield her from violence and his need for her to understand the reality of his world, she made her choice. "I trust you," she said simply. "Do whatever you need to do to keep everyone safe." The relief in his expression told her how much her acceptance meant to him. But there was also a hardening around his eyes that suggested he was preparing himself for actions that would change how she saw him forever. He kissed her once, briefly but intensely, like a man going to war who wasn't certain he'd return unchanged. "Stay with Alessandro," he instructed, indicating the younger man who'd been assigned to her protection. "No matter what you hear or see, don't try to help. This will be over quickly." Watching Dante and his team move toward Romano's was like witnessing a military operation unfold. They coordinated with hand signals and positioned themselves around the building with the precision of professionals who'd done this many times before. Catalina found herself holding her breath as Dante approached the front entrance, looking for all the world like a man coming home from work rather than someone walking into a potentially deadly confrontation. The sounds that came from inside the restaurant over the next 10 minutes were muffled but unmistakable. Shouting, the crash of furniture, what sounded like gunshots, then silence. When Dante emerged, his suit was disheveled and there was blood on his knuckles, but his expression was calm and satisfied. "It's finished," he said simply when he reached her side. "Derek Mitchell will never bother you again." She didn't ask for details about what had happened inside, and he didn't offer them. Some questions were better left unasked. Some knowledge was too heavy for people who hadn't chosen to live in his world. What mattered was that the staff walked out unharmed, that the threat had been eliminated definitively, and that Dante had returned to her exactly as he'd promised. Later that night, as they sat in his penthouse watching the city lights twinkle below, Catalina found herself processing what had happened and what it meant for their future. She'd witnessed firsthand the kind of decisive action Dante was capable of when people he cared about were threatened, and while the violence disturbed her on a moral level, she couldn't deny that it had been necessary to protect innocent lives. "Are you all right with what happened tonight?" Dante asked quietly, his voice careful and searching. "I know it's not easy to accept that kind of solution." She considered the question seriously, examining her feelings without the luxury of pretending his world was anything other than what it was. "I'm all right with being safe," she said finally. "I'm all right with knowing that you'll do whatever it takes to protect the people you care about." Derek made his choices, and they led him to a place where violence was the only language he understood. Dante's relief was visible, and she realized how much he'd been dreading her potential rejection of who he was and what he'd done to keep her safe. For a man who commanded such power and respect, he was surprisingly vulnerable when it came to her opinion of him. "I love you," she said suddenly, the words coming from a place of absolute certainty she hadn't known she possessed. "I love your strength and your gentleness and your willingness to do hard things to protect people who can't protect themselves." The confession seemed to stun him into silence, and for a moment she wondered if she'd revealed too much too soon. But then he was kissing her with a desperation that spoke of feelings held too long in check, and she knew her honesty had been exactly what he needed to hear. "I love you too," he said against her lips, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I ever thought I'd be capable of loving anyone." Outside the windows of the penthouse, Chicago stretched in all directions like a promise of the future they could build together. Derek's threat was finally, definitively over, and for the first time since that night at Romano's restaurant, Catalina felt truly free to choose her own path forward. 3 months later, Catalina stood in the bathroom of Dante's penthouse staring at her reflection with a sense of wonder that still caught her by surprise. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened server who had cowered at table 12 all those months ago. Her dark hair gleamed with health, her brown eyes sparkled with confidence, and her smile came easily now without the careful calculation that had once preceded every expression. She was getting ready for dinner at Romano's, the first time she'd been back to the restaurant since the night Derek's threat had been eliminated forever. Dante had asked if she was ready to reclaim that space, to replace the memories of fear and humiliation with something beautiful, and she'd surprised herself by saying yes immediately. The restaurant had been where her nightmare began, but it had also been where Dante had first stepped into her life, like an avenging angel. It seemed fitting to celebrate their engagement there, surrounded by the people who had become her chosen family. The engagement ring on her finger caught the light as she applied lipstick, and she paused to admire the elegant emerald surrounded by diamonds that Dante had chosen with such obvious care. He'd proposed 2 weeks ago in the Art Institute, kneeling in front of her favorite Monet while bemused tourists pretended not to stare. The setting had been perfect, romantic without being ostentatious, acknowledging her passions rather than his wealth. When she'd said yes through tears of joy, he'd looked like a man who'd been granted a miracle he'd never dared hope for. The past 3 months had transformed her life in ways she was still processing. True to his word, Dante had made it possible for her to return to Northwestern, handling her tuition and living expenses with the casual generosity of someone for whom money was simply a tool to solve problems. She was back in her art history classes, working toward the degree Derek had convinced her was frivolous, and every day felt like reclaiming a piece of herself she'd thought was lost forever. Her professors had welcomed her back with enthusiasm, and she'd thrown herself into her studies with the passion of someone making up for lost time. The paper she'd written on Renaissance patronage and power had earned praise that made her glow with pride, and her advisor was already discussing graduate school possibilities that would have seemed impossible just months before. Dante attended her presentations when his schedule allowed, sitting in the back of lecture halls like a proud parent watching his child perform, his presence both supportive and protective. The integration into his family had been smoother than she'd anticipated, though it had required careful navigation of relationships built on respect and earned trust. His mother, Elena Romano, was a formidable woman in her 70s who ruled the family's legitimate business interests with an iron fist wrapped in Italian silk. Catalina had been terrified of their first meeting, but Elena had taken one look at the way her son watched his girlfriend and declared her acceptable with the kind of approval that opened all doors in the Romano world. Marco and Alessandro had become protective older brothers, treating her with the same fierce loyalty they showed Dante, while never making her feel like an outsider who needed to prove her worth. They'd taken her to shooting ranges and self-defense classes, insisting that anyone in their circle needed to be able to protect themselves. The skills they taught her weren't just practical, they were symbols of acceptance, proof that she belonged in their dangerous world not as a liability to be guarded, but as family to be empowered. The legal resolution of Derek's disappearance had been handled with the same efficiency that characterized everything in Dante's world. Detective Chun had informed her that Derek Mitchell had apparently left Chicago suddenly after liquidating his assets and closing his accounts. His car had been found abandoned near the lake, and the working theory was that he'd relocated to avoid debts he'd accumulated to fund his escalating surveillance of her. Catalina knew better, of course, but she'd also learned that some knowledge was better left unspoken. Derek was gone, definitively and forever, and that was what mattered. Tonight's dinner was a celebration of their engagement, but it was also a symbolic reclaiming of the space where their story had begun. Romano's had been redecorated since that night, though she suspected the changes had less to do with the brief violence that had occurred there and more to do with Dante's desire to give her a fresh start in a place that held difficult memories. The new decor was warmer, more intimate, with soft lighting and comfortable seating that invited lingering conversations over excellent wine. She made her way to the living room where Dante was waiting, and the sight of him still made her breath catch even after months of waking up beside him. He was devastating in a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean frame, but it was the way his face lit up when he saw her that made her heart race. After years of Derek's critical assessments of her appearance, Dante's obvious appreciation felt like a gift she received new every day. "You look beautiful," he said, crossing to her with the fluid grace that had caught her attention that first night. The dress he'd bought her was a deep blue silk that complemented her complexion perfectly, another example of his attention to details that made her feel cherished rather than purchased. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, adjusting his tie with movements that had become comfortably familiar. "Going back to Romano's, I mean. Making it our place instead of where everything went wrong." Dante's smile held satisfaction and anticipation in equal measure. "I've been ready since the moment I decided you were mine," he replied, his possessive tone sending warmth through her chest. "Tonight is about celebrating our future, not mourning the past." The drive to Romano's passed in comfortable conversation about their wedding plans, which had grown from the simple ceremony they'd originally envisioned into something that would accommodate both families while reflecting their unique situation. Dante's connections meant security considerations, but Catalina's desire for her friends and remaining family to attend meant finding ways to blend his dangerous world with her normal one. It was a delicate balance, but one that felt achievable now that they'd learned to communicate openly about their respective needs and concerns. Romano's was perfect when they arrived. Exactly the kind of romantic setting she'd always imagined for special occasions, but had never experienced with Derek. The staff greeted them like returning royalty, and she could see genuine affection in their faces rather than the fearful deference she'd expected. These people worked for Dante's family, but they also clearly cared about his happiness, and her acceptance into their circle felt warm and authentic. Their table was in a corner that offered privacy while still allowing them to see the entire dining room, a tactical consideration that had become second nature to her after months of learning how Dante's mind worked. He never sat with his back to doors or windows, always positioned himself to monitor exits and entrances, and she'd grown to appreciate the careful vigilance that kept them all safe. The dinner was magnificent, course after course of expertly prepared food that reminded her why Romano's had such an excellent reputation. But more than the cuisine, it was the conversation that made the evening special. They talked about her classes, his business ventures, their shared love of art and literature, the kind of wide-ranging discussion that Derek had never been capable of sustaining. Dante listened to her thoughts about museum curation with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he valued her expertise and ambitions rather than merely tolerating them. Halfway through the meal, Elena Romano arrived with Marco and Alessandro in tow, transforming their intimate dinner into a family celebration. Catalina had grown to love these impromptu gatherings that characterized life in the Romano orbit, the way formal occasions became warm and boisterous when the people Dante cared about were involved. Elena examined the engagement ring with the critical eye of someone who understood fine jewelry, declared it acceptable but too modest, then immediately began planning improvements to the wedding venue that would reflect the family's status appropriately. As the evening progressed and wine flowed freely, Catalina found herself thinking about how completely her life had changed from that terrifying night when Derek had threatened her in this very room. She'd been so frightened then, so convinced that she was trapped in a relationship that was slowly destroying her sense of self. The woman who had trembled at Derek's harsh words felt like a stranger now, someone she'd been before she learned her own strength. The conversation turned to family traditions and future plans, and she listened with growing wonder as Elena described holidays and celebrations that she was now part of by virtue of loving Dante. There would be Christmas gatherings and summer trips to Sicily, extended family who would welcome her as a Romano bride, generations of traditions that she could help preserve and pass on to the children they'd talked about having together. When Elena excused herself to speak with the chef about future catering arrangements for the wedding, Dante leaned closer to Catalina with the intimacy of long-established couples. "Happy?" he asked quietly, his hand finding hers across the white tablecloth. "Completely," she replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "6 months ago, I couldn't have imagined feeling this safe, this valued, this excited about the future. You saved me from something that was killing me slowly." "We saved each other," Dante corrected gently. "You gave me something I didn't know I was missing. The possibility of a normal life. Someone to share it with who loves me for who I am rather than what I can provide." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the arrival of dessert, a spectacular confection that the chef had clearly prepared specially for their engagement celebration. As they shared the decadent chocolate creation, Catalina found herself looking around the dining room with new eyes. This was her place now, part of her story and her future rather than just the site of past trauma. The transformation felt complete and deeply satisfying. 1 year later, Catalina sat in the same corner table at Romano's, but everything about the scene was different. The simple engagement dinner had been replaced by a celebration of their first wedding anniversary, and her left hand now bore both the emerald engagement ring and a platinum wedding band that matched the one Dante wore. Her figure had changed as well, the gentle curve of early pregnancy visible beneath the flowing dress Dante had chosen to accommodate her changing body. The wedding 6 months earlier had been everything she dreamed of and more, a perfect blend of elegance and intimacy that had brought together the disparate elements of their lives. Her sister had served as maid of honor, her parents had walked her down the aisle, and her college friends had danced alongside members of Dante's organization in a celebration that proved love could bridge any divide. The ceremony had taken place in the garden of the Romano family estate, surrounded by flowers and filled with joy that had made even the security considerations feel romantic rather than ominous. Their honeymoon in Italy had been a revelation of art and culture that had fed her soul while cementing their bond as partners in life and intellectual pursuits. Dante had arranged private tours of galleries and museums, had stood beside her in the Sistine Chapel, watching her tears of joy at seeing Michelangelo's work in person, had made love to her in centuries-old palazzos, while promising to show her every beautiful thing the world had to offer. When they'd returned to Chicago, she'd felt like she was carrying pieces of Renaissance magic in her heart. The pregnancy had been a surprise that had thrilled them both, confirmation that their love was creating new life and new possibilities. Dante was already planning nursery renovations and interviewing potential nannies with the same careful attention he gave all aspects of their security, but Catalina knew that despite his protective instincts, he would be a wonderful father. She'd seen him with his young cousins and nieces, the way his controlled exterior melted into playfulness and genuine affection when children were involved. Now, as they celebrated their first anniversary in the place where they'd met, she found herself marveling at the journey that had brought them here. The frightened woman who had served Derek at table 12 was gone, replaced by someone confident and beloved and secure in her own worth. The transformation hadn't been easy or instant, but it had been complete, and every day she felt grateful for the man whose intervention had made it possible. "I love you," she said, raising her wine glass in a toast that had become their tradition. "Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." "I love you too," Dante replied, his green-gray eyes warm with emotion that no longer needed to be hidden or controlled. "Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't make you weak. It makes you invincible." As they clinked glasses in the warm light of Romano's dining room, Catalina thought about how differently this story might have ended if Dante hadn't been sitting at the next table that night, if he hadn't recognized the signs of abuse and decided to intervene, if she hadn't found the courage to accept help from a dangerous stranger who turned out to be the love of her life. Sometimes the most dangerous situations led to the most beautiful outcomes, she realized. Sometimes the person who saved you was exactly the person you needed to save in return. Whether you've lived in a dangerous situation or simply felt unsafe in your own relationship, you probably understand how terrifying it can be to trust someone new with your heart. Have you ever found unexpected love and protection in a situation that started with fear? Sometimes the most powerful love stories begin with someone brave enough to step in when we need them most, when we're too afraid to believe that safety and genuine care are possible. That moment when a stranger becomes a protector and protection becomes forever might just be the most dangerous and beautiful thing of all.